Hello, welcome back to the second part of the first panel today. I once again want to thank the organizers of this conference, Ian Bogost, Michael Nietzsche, and John Sharp for putting this together. We have now the pleasure to listen to our last speaker of this panel, Frank Lantz. He's the creative director and co-founder of Area Code, a New York-based developer that creates cross-media, location-based, and social network games. Over the past 8 years, he helped pioneer the genre of large-scale, real-world games as one of the creators of the big urban game, which turned the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul into the world's largest board game, Conquest, which featured the first major application of Zima code in the United States, and Pac-Manhattan, a life-sized version of the arcade classic created by the students in his big game class in New York University. For more than 12 years, Lantz has taught game design at the NYU in the Interactive Telecommunications program and at the School of Visual Arts at Parsons in New York School for Design. He's currently director of the NYU Game Center. I have now the pleasure to introduce Frank Lantz with his talk, Doorknobs and Butterflies, Games After Art.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It really is a pleasure to be speaking with you. And, there are three historical figures I'm going to look at in today's talk: Ludwig Wittgenstein, Vladimir Nabokov, and Marcel Duchamp. Specifically, I want to talk about Wittgenstein as architect, Nabokov as entomologist, and Duchamp as chess player. And I want to take the initial inspiration from Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein was driven to examine the problems that he struggled with because they bothered him. By wrestling with these issues of the structure of logic and the limits of what we can know and say about the world, he was trying to get relief from the pain that was caused by these vexing and unresolved thoughts. So I want to talk today about something that is bothering me, which is the status of games as an aesthetic form. Now, I believe games are an aesthetic form, something like music, literature, painting, dance, and so on. This seems plainly obvious to me. I think they always have been. And the rise of the video game, which appears so much more like these other things, has brought most people, I believe, around to thinking about games in this way. But even as we celebrate a new kind of awareness regarding what games are and what they can do and how they fit into our lives, there is something about this that bothers me, that makes me want to say, wait, games are not quite so much like these other things after all. It's a little hard to describe this feeling that bothers me, because something like this. Games have a wildness, a strangeness to them. And sometimes I feel like what we're doing when we talk and think and write about games as an aesthetic form is to domesticate them, to tame this wildness, explain this strangeness, and hang it on our walls, display it in our parlors and museums, and preserve it in our history books. Because when I compare these other things to games, music, literature, painting, dance, and so on, that's a little bit what they feel like to me, a little domesticated, comfortable, institutionalized, safe. But this is not to say that games do not belong to the realm of aesthetics. In fact, the wildness, the strangeness that I sense about them, this aspect of games is exactly the thing that marks them as an aesthetic of form to me. Rather, it is this historical moment at which our collective attention is on games and our understanding of them is shifting to consider them within the context of aesthetics. This moment offers a rare and valuable opportunity to look at this whole category of human activity: creativity, aesthetics, art, to say, what is it? How does it work? What do we want from it? How do we want it to fit into our lives? Asking these questions begins by acknowledging the discomfort of our thoughts, the way that we squirm a little when we talk about placing games beside these other activities, the way we twist and squeeze them to fit into this category. But what if instead of twisting and squeezing games, we could break open this category, dismantle it, take it apart, and put it together again differently? Because I like this feeling of wildness, this strangeness. This is what aesthetics should feel like. And we have an opportunity to recapture that feeling, intensify it, relight the fire that burns in that category of human activity. I want those of us who talk and think and write about games to seize this opportunity, instead of squeezing games with all their difficult and problematic wildness into our frames and parlors and museums and galleries and university departments and books and magazines, so that we can recognize them and understand them and discuss them more comfortably. Instead, we should make the effort to see them for what they are with all their incomprehensible and uncomfortable wildness. Let them break that category of human activity and make it strange again. I mean, no one likes pain, but I am somewhat grateful for this uncomfortable feeling because I believe that I have become too comfortable thinking about all of these things, or rather too comfortable not thinking about them. And now I'm going to share a little bit of that pain with you. So you're welcome. The evolution of the feeling, it goes a little bit something like this. Games are an art form, or something very much like an art form, but let's call them an aesthetic form, because that sidesteps all the complicated and intentionally confusing and overloaded baggage of the term art, except it doesn't really. So to the question of art, we begin by saying, well, it's not a superlative, right? It's not a special status that we confer on certain cultural objects. It is a category of human activity. Music is an art form, and therefore all songs belong to this category, not just this one and this one, but all of them. And then we can argue about which ones are great, in what ways, and why, because that's what aesthetics is all about. This argumentation, this conversation about different kinds of greatness, this exercise of taste. This is the modern way of talking about art. This is aesthetics. And of course games fit into this category. How could they not? But what games are we talking about? And here comes another little sidestep, because when most people say game, what they really mean is single-player video game. And fair enough. I love these things too. And they are so much more easy to recognize as the kinds of things that works of art are. The work of art is a tidy package of qualities and attributes. It is easy to locate physically, historically, it is visible, sensible, its contours are apparent. The single-player video game shares many of these features. And in this respect, the video game, especially the single-player video game, is like a novel or a painting or a poem or an opera or a play. It seems like a tidy package of qualities and attributes, like material that has been given form. I think Super Mario 64 is better than Super Mario Galaxy because of this feature or that quality. I think Crackdown is better than Assassin's Creed because of this, this, and this. But having recognized that, do we stop there? Are games in aesthetic form to the degree that they resemble novels, paintings, poems, operas, plays, interactive systems crafted into something similar to these forms? Because that's one way to avoid the pain. But I can't help thinking about all the other games I play, the games that I really love, the important ones that have touched me, moved me, changed my life. And some of them are single-player video games, but many of them are not. Games like poker and Go. What are we to do with these games? Put them over here to be thought about later? Do we say video games are a new form and that's what we're looking at, and they're an aesthetic form and these other games are something else? They provide different values, fit into our lives in a different way? Because they don't really feel that different. And they don't really look that different if you look at the people playing them and the way that they fit into people's lives. The kinds of experiences they provide. The people playing Madden, or playing Ultimate Frisbee, or playing Magic the Gathering, or playing Modern Warfare 2, or World of Warcraft, or Monkey Ball, or golf. Are we really going to say that Monkey Ball, a game that I like quite a bit, is inherently more important, more interesting, more worthy of our interest and attention than golf? Simply because it's easier to see its contours and its qualities and attributes? Monkey Ball has a physics engine, a control scheme, characters, levels, graphics. What does golf have? What are we supposed to admire about golf? Its elegant rule set? Come on. I mean, it's Scottish people hitting a ball into a hole with a stick. Where is golf anyway? I can point to my copy of Monkey Ball, but what do I point to with golf? Where is the work? A single instance of 9 holes with my friend on a Sunday morning. A tournament with its virtuoso performances and dramatic arc. The artistry of Arnold Palmer, Jack Nicklaus, Tiger Woods. Oh, Tiger Woods. The sculpted landscape of a beautifully designed course. A $2,000 club. So if we exclude these other games, narrow our attention so that we're only looking at these things that resemble artworks, we make it easy on ourselves, but at the cost of being lazy and a little dishonest. Because some of these things are the best examples of games that are beautiful and meaning components of the lives of millions of people. They're the games that grown-ups play, the ones already taken seriously by intellectuals and the general public. But if we include them, then the pain starts up, because these things don't look like works of art. They're like sprawling messes compared to the tidy packages of features and qualities in a work of art. They stretch across generations. They emerge over time like languages with many creators or none. They contain multitudes. Comparing tennis to Go is like comparing German to Italian, or like comparing not two pieces of music, but playing the piano versus playing the violin. And this is true of trying to compare something like poker to something like Modern Warfare 2 multiplayer. How are we to judge these things, examine their features, compare them, make clever arguments about their merits, recommend this or that one, when they're like lifelong habits, careers, places to live? So I want to hold both these things in my mind at the same time: the wild strangeness of games and their status as a form of aesthetics. And to do so, and be honest to what games are and how they fit into my life, I need to change how I think about aesthetics. Maybe I will need to give up some of the things I used to assume about aesthetics, that it is possible to judge these things, examine their features, compare them, and make clever arguments about their merits. But maybe I can get something much better in exchange. And as inspiration, I have my 3 subjects, and the devotion each one had to a particular activity. These activities, I believe, can help illustrate, by way of example, some of the strange qualities of games as an aesthetic form. Vidkun Stein and architecture, Vladimir Nabokov and butterfly collecting, and Marcel Duchamp and chess. Vidkun Stein was, of course, one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. But he was also, during his life, a teacher and a gardener, and for 2 years, from 1926 to 1928, he devoted himself fully to designing a house in Vienna for his sister, Gretel. During this time, it seems like the task absorbed him completely. For those years, he wasn't a philosopher doing architecture, he was an architect designing a house. As a designer, he was obsessed, lavishing endless time and money on every aspect of the house in pursuit of a precise, coherent vision. Here are several quotes from the critic Bernard Leitner, who has written extensively about the house. The house only appears to be static. Motion is an intricate part of Wittgensteinian architectural aesthetics. How doors and window doors are opened and closed, the way one interacts with the house, the way spaces interweave, how light reflects on the polished, lacquered, color surfaces of the floor, metal doors, and walls. All of these factors give the building its temporal dimension. Many aspects of Wittgenstein's aesthetics can only be deciphered through time and movement. Ludwig Wittgenstein gives movement form based on the laws of mechanics. In contrast to the machine aesthetics of the 20s, movement to Wittgenstein is mechanics: lever, weight, support, energy, friction. And famously, one of the main qualities of Wittgenstein as an architect is an obsessive focus on the details of the interiors: radiators, window shades, things like that, doorknobs. Here's Bernard Leitner again. For Wittgenstein, no form stylistically results from another one. The door handle has nothing in common with the recessed capital. They are both, along with everything else, the result of a very specific will to form, a very special form-finding process, a very unique way of thinking. It is said that these handles took over a year to design and manufacture to Wittgenstein's spec. Every detail is completely thought through: the asymmetry, the mechanics of how the two sides fit together, the shape of the end, which is not a hemisphere, but something called a calotte, and is exactly 5 millimeters high. There are stories of metal workers breaking down in tears as the result of his exacting demands. You can even buy a version of the Wittgenstein doorknob for your own house. But you shouldn't, according to Leitner anyway, because each single detail of the house was custom designed for its specific place and function and its interconnected relationship to all the other details, and therefore, quoting Leitner, a self-contained architecture from which no academic ideas can be deduced, nor a single form extracted. The marketing of a so-called Wittgenstein handle is a perversion of the Wittgensteinian form-finding process. So Wittgenstein, who had studied mechanical engineering in college, was obsessed with custom engineering every detail of these elements, their function, the way that people in the space would interact with them. But it is not so much the house that I want to talk about here, because the house is an aesthetic object par excellence. It is easy to see it, to locate it in space and time and examine its qualities. What I want to talk about is Wittgenstein's experience with architecture. What a strange thing to devote himself to this activity, to stop doing philosophy for 2 years and design doorknobs. What are the qualities of that experience? The philosophy and the house are both the work of the same man, but one of them is work and one of them is something else. It is non-philosophy. The house doesn't have theories, claims, and arguments. It has doorknobs and window shades. But it's important to remember that Wittgenstein's philosophy was in itself an attempt to get outside of theories, claims, and arguments, to show that these things are language games and to break their spell. And I think this process, this avocation, this non-philosophy, these years in which Vidkun Stein played architect was a totally different expression of a similar set of passionate and deeply felt impulses, the playful work of a particular human brain, driven by demons to solve problems. Like his philosophy, his architecture was an attempt to fashion an escape from philosophy. Doorknobs instead of theories. So while Vidkun Stein gave the impression of a man pursued by demons, Vladimir Nabokov appears to have been a man in pursuit of pleasure. Throughout his life, he took endless delight in the infinitely complicated details of the world. It is well known that in addition to being one of the most important novelists of the 20th century, Nabokov was also a serious and committed lepidopterist. This was a lifelong pursuit, starting from when he was 7 years old, and continuing up until his final days. And it appears to have been both an obsession and a source of deep pleasure. Much more than just a hobby, he structured his life around it, collecting and analyzing butterflies, writing serious scientific papers on the subject, and contributing in substantial ways to the field of lepidoptery. But like Vidkun Stein's house, I'm less interested in what Nabokov contributed to lepidoptery and more interested in what lepidoptery contributed to Nabokov. What were the qualities of that experience? What did it mean to him? What were the values and pleasures and meaning he got from collecting and studying butterflies? Was it a recreation, a pastime? The idea of chasing butterflies is almost a cliche of something trivial, distracting, ephemeral, childish. Is that what we think? Was this a distraction from Nabokov's serious work as a novelist, translator, and poet? Over here we have the novels that delight us, and comfort us, and amaze us. And over here we have the butterflies that delighted and comforted and amazed him. They don't look very much alike. One is storytelling, poetry, the weaving together of ideas and images and language into a lucid dream that opens up a window onto the world. The other is chasing beautiful insects, to study their form, to contemplate their extraordinary inhuman beauty, and understand how the distinct features that express this beauty are also symbols in a complex system of logic, graphemes in a genetic language that expresses delicate, precise truths about the deep systems of reproduction, nature, and survival. Another kind of window onto the world. He once wrote, in discussing the diverging variations within a certain species, this scheme, of course, is not a phylogenetic tree, but merely its shadow on a plane surface, since a sequence in time is not really deducible from a synchronous series. So yes, lepidoptery is science, but it was much more than that for Nabokov. It was a source of beauty and adventure and elusive truth, an activity with deep aesthetic resonance. Here's part of a poem he wrote when he thought he had discovered a new species. Dark pictures, thrones, the stones that pilgrims kiss, poems that take 1,000 years to die, but ape the immortality of this red label on a little butterfly. So it was science, but it was simultaneously recreation, hobby, addiction, and guilty pleasure. In Speak Memory, Nabokov has this to say about his obsession. Few things indeed have I known in the way of emotion or appetite, ambition or achievement that could surpass in richness and strength the excitement of entomological exploration. From the very first, it had a great many intertwinkling facets. One of them was the acute desire to be alone, since any companion, no matter how quiet, interfered with the concentrated enjoyment of my mania. Its gratification admitted of no compromise. In this connection, I remember the visit of a schoolmate, a boy of whom I was quite fond. His father had recently perished in an accident. The family was ruined, and the stout-hearted lad, not being able to afford the price of a railway ticket, had bicycled all those miles to spend a few days with me. On the morning following his arrival, I did everything I could to get out of the house for my morning hike without his knowing where I had gone. Breakfastless, with hysterical haste, I gathered my net, pillboxes, killing jar, and escaped through the window. Once in the forest, I was safe, but still I walked on, my calves quaking, my eyes full of scalding tears, the whole of me twitching with shame and self-disgust, as I visualized my poor friend with his long pale face and black tie, moping in the hot garden, patting the panting dogs for want of something better to do, and trying hard to justify my absence to himself. Okay, so I'm not suggesting that Pokemon is anywhere near as deep and substantial a pastime as real butterfly collecting. But isn't it something like that? Don't we recognize in both activities the outlines of the same passionate obsessions to explore, to hunt, to collect, and master? And I know I recognize in this curious blend of scientific knowledge and pleasure and addiction my own experience of poker, both in the complex mathematical technicalities of probability and Bayesian logic and expected value, and in the hot rush of oblivion. Nabokov himself draws out the game-like qualities of his evocation in another passage from Speak Memory. I had long wanted that particular species, and when near enough I struck. You have heard champion tennis players moan after muffing an easy shot. You may have seen the face of the world-famous grandmaster Wilhelm Eldensson when, during a simultaneous display in a Minsk cafe, he lost his rook by an absurd oversight to the local amateur and pediatrician Dr. Schack, who eventually won. But that day, nobody, except my older self, could see me shake out a piece of twig from an otherwise empty net and stare at a hole in the tarlatan. He loved it so much, this activity. And there's something so deeply beautiful and important and meaningful in it, and yet in a way that is not in the slightest bit literary. And finally, this guy, Marcel Duchamp, who must be sort of the patron saint of this conference, right? We know that he loved chess. He played it his whole life at a very high level, even representing France in a bunch of important international tournaments. Writing and publishing a highly technical, theoretical book on a particular aspect of certain rare endgame situations. And chess seemed to embody for Duchamp a supremely cerebral and intellectual activity. Partly as a result of Duchampian influence, we tend to think of contemporary painters as abstruse, theory-spouting hyper-intellectuals. But in his time, there was a bit of the opposite cliché. The French used to have an expression, d'être bête comme un peintre, to be stupid like a painter. And we know he contemptuously referred to painters as being intoxicated with turpentine. And you can imagine that the logic and precision of chess was like a kind of antidote to the intoxication brought on by an overindulgence in visual beauty and other retinal effects. But if chess was hangover medicine for an art drunk on beauty, then it was certainly hair of the dog. Duchamp famously refused to see a hard distinction between chess and art. He spoke eloquently of the aesthetic qualities of the game. Here's a quote from Duchamp. In chess, there are some extremely beautiful things in the domain of movement, but not in the visual domain. It's the imagining of the movement, or the gesture, that makes the beauty in this case. It's completely in one's gray matter. His friend, gallery owner Julian Levy, said that Duchamp once told him, "It wasn't a war game, it's an aesthetic game, and you feel the shape of the board as it begins to shift its pattern, and you make it beautiful, even if you lose." And speaking at the New York State Chess Federation in 1952, Duchamp says, "Beauty in chess is closer to beauty in poetry. The chess pieces are the block alphabet, which shapes thoughts. And these thoughts, although making a visual design on the chessboard, express their beauty abstractly, like a poem. Actually, I believe that every chess player experiences a mixture of two aesthetic pleasures. First, the abstract image akin to the poetic idea of writing. Second, the sensuous pleasure of the ideographic execution of that image on the chessboard. From my close contact with artists and chess players, I have come to the personal conclusion that while all artists are not chess players, all chess players are artists." And it's important to keep in mind that Duchamp wasn't trying to make some complicated theoretical point that he sees some special connection between chess and his own personal artistic vision. He's saying something that seemed simple and obvious to him. Chess is beautiful. To play chess is to experience a certain kind of complex aesthetic pleasure. All chess players are artists. And his description of these aesthetic qualities are not mystical or obscure. They are not oblique and playful the way much of his writing can be. It is as if he was trying very hard to articulate in the most straightforward way possible a very intense feeling that is very hard to describe. Here he is again. Chess in itself is a hobby, a game. Everybody can play it. But I took it very seriously and enjoyed it because I found some common points between chess and painting. When you play a game of chess, it is like designing something or constructing some mechanism of some kind by which you win or lose. And like the precisely engineered functional details of Vidkun Stein's house, this focus on operational mechanics is central to Duchamp's view of the aesthetics of chess. Chess is a mechanistic sculpture. The bishop is like a lever. A game of chess is plastic. You construct it, and it creates beautiful problems. It's also important to note, as John Sharp did earlier, that Duchamp never locates the beauty of chess in the game design, but only in the play. He never talks about chess as a work. For Duchamp, chess is not like a painting. Chess is like painting. We can see this as a historical quirk. Nowadays, we recognize games as works. We focus on their formal qualities as designed objects, and this is a kind of progress in a way. But I prefer to think that there is something more to it than that. The aesthetic dimensions of chess aren't easily located in the formal qualities of chess as a designed object. Chess is a language, a spiritual discipline, a martial art, a subculture. It's also a designed work of culture that many people co-authored over the course of generations. But that doesn't make it easier to understand its aesthetic dimensions. It makes it harder. Duchamp once wondered before making his first ready-made whether it might be possible to make a work which is not a work of art. But maybe it's not just the art, but the work itself that we can let go of, or at least on which we can start to loosen our grip. This is the Hanma Z1 driver. I think it's about $2,000. I don't play golf, but I think this club is probably beautiful. It is will to form incarnate. It is all the power of precision engineering turned into itself in order to do nothing more than engineer precisely, to accomplish an arbitrary goal to an infinite degree of accuracy. Humans are good at making tools. Architecture, lepidoptery, chess, engineering, science, logic. Chess is as different from art as architecture is from philosophy, as butterfly collecting is from literature. And yet all of these things seem related to me, seem to hint at a pattern. First of all, they are all avocations. They existed in the generous margins of the lives of these men, even as they spilled over onto the page. And they were all pursuits that, no matter how obsessive, were highly rational about problem solving, crafting solutions, accomplishing goals. Aesthetic activities are things you do when your work is done. Playing games, like telling stories, making pictures, and singing songs, is something we do when the harvest is in, when the hunt is over, and the wolves have been chased away, and the dishes are washed. But the status of games relative to work is much less clear, much more complicated and ambiguous. Stories are about remembering and explaining. Pictures are about looking and interpreting. And games are about doing. Games are about solving problems and accomplishing goals. And moreover, stories make the process of remembering and explaining present to consciousness. It's not just that we use stories to indulge our desire to observe the behavior of other humans and think about their motivations and analyze their social behavior and use language to describe it. Literature also allows us to become aware of that desire and that use of language, to go deeper and deeper into it and simultaneously step outside of it and observe it. And paintings and sculptures make the act of looking and interpreting this cognitive process that is an enormous aspect of our consciousness, but is not normally visible to us. They make this act itself visible. We go deeper and deeper into looking, but also step briefly outside of it and become aware of it. And games do this for thought and effort and the accomplishment of goals. And applying thought and effort to accomplish goals is work, so games do this for work. Humans are constantly thinking, learning, making decisions, communicating, judging, deciding which goals to work towards, and struggling to achieve them. Games are the art form by which we go deeper and deeper into these processes, but also simultaneously step back from them and become aware of them and contemplate them. Games are the means by which thought itself becomes available to our senses. Chess is a way of making the act of thinking, learning, and decision-making present to us in a way that we can appreciate and enjoy for its own sake. Humans are fish that swim in the ocean of instrumental reason. Thought and effort applied to the accomplishment of goals, this is what we are made of, and it is also our prison. How could we ever escape that? Games amplify and magnify instrumental reason, and by so doing open up a space beyond instrumental reason from which it can be observed. By traveling to the very farthest points of instrumental reason, games almost allow us to escape. The ritual that allows us to contemplate goals and values from the inside out, how are we ever expected to evaluate that? If you are waiting for games to be put on a pedestal like art, stop waiting. They will always be on the inside out, looking outside in. We are very good at making tools that solve problems, and this is our exuberant flourish, our virtuosic excess, a tool for its own sake, which is also maybe a brief window outside of tool-making, skills, goals, accomplishments, a brief escape from these things that rule us and govern our lives, our work, philosophy, literature, art, our goals, the effort we exert to achieve them, and the tools we master to do it. A golf ball is a tiny thing, and the course is enormous. The slightest change in the way we hold the club or swing it has huge repercussions. This effect is like a lens that magnifies the meaning of our actions. Small changes in the initial conditions explode exponentially to enormously different outcomes. A golf club is a simple machine that magnifies physical force. The game of golf is a simple machine that magnifies cause and effect itself. That we may drown in it. That we may, for a Sunday morning, escape from it. And that's just golf. I don't even like golf. I like monkey ball. I love video games a lot. I love German board games. I love authored games that are clear cultural works, tidy packages of attributes and qualities. But the games which have reached into my life and changed me as a person, the games that have opened up a window onto the world, where even if I'm not an expert, I get that little tingle of specialist knowledge, that feeling of being part of the conversation, of belonging to the tribe. These games are fields of study, avocations like architecture, lepidoptery, chess. And if our discussion of aesthetics can't acknowledge these games that are too big to fit into our existing institutions and buildings and vocabulary, then those things must change to make room. Let us follow the wildness, the strangeness, and give up easy comfort for useful pain, to see the important work of our lives from the outside in. I believe that games are valuable and meaningful in ways that are like art and unlike art. The mythical future game, the game that all will recognize as a masterwork because it resembles a Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, or a nude descending a staircase, or Lolita. This is a tidy Messiah whose arrival I do not expect, do not believe in, and whose comforting familiar reassurances I do not want. Instead, consider Duchamp's endgames, Nabokov's butterflies, and Vidkun Stein's doorknobs, and let us prepare for a future stranger and more beautiful than a million boring masterpieces could ever deliver. Thank you.
Thank you for a very thoughtful talk. Well, my question is something that you mentioned. You talked about the rational obsessive pursuits, and I was just wondering whether you find the rational obsessive are kind of opposites of each other, and whether they're actually compatible or maybe not compatible.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think sometimes I think that games are like an art form for Asperger's sufferers. You know what I mean? Like, it's true. I mean, there are a lot of kind of hyper-rational and obsessive qualities to games, and a lot of that expressed in the personalities of the people who love them and make them. And I think that there's something real about that, right? And it's true. And I think that that we are maybe a little embarrassed about it because it's the nerdy quality of games. But maybe there's something really positive and good about that obsessive rationality. And that it's actually a feature of humans that hasn't gotten a lot of celebration. And one of the, I think, qualities of more traditional art, like performance, like musical performance or theater, even painting, is its charm, right? Is that it's persuasive in a way through its charisma, and by creating images, it sways you and touches your heart, you know. And there's this other type of cognitive function which has to do with more analytical, kind of rational look at the world. That maybe that's on the rise, and maybe that's not such a bad thing, right? I mean, maybe the two need to be more in harmony, and an art form that really embraces that kind of obsessive rationality, along with the charm and the charisma is good. Yeah.
What's interesting, you actually observe these qualities in both engineers and scientists.
Yeah.
And artists, perhaps, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And in these guys, like Nabokov's like interest in butterflies is nerdy, you know.
So where do you think this drive comes from?
I think it's a cognitive. It's just part of the human brain, right? It's one of our functions is our ability to analyze more abstractly. You know, instead of responding impulsively to and with a strong use of emotion based on the images we see. We also sometimes like stop and think and say, oh, wow, things are not as they appear, and I can kind of reason my way out of this situation. And that's obviously a, yes, science and engineering is built on that. And games, I think, have a foot in each of those traditions, art and the other.
Hi. Oops. Hi, I've got a question for you regarding the, regarding this discussion about activity versus, or the artifact versus what inspires it, which seems to be one of the core aspects of your talk here. So if we're to say look at Nabokov and the artifacts that he creates, so his novels like Lolita, and then we're to look at sort of what inspires him or what is component to him as human being with the Lepidoptery, there's kind of a there's kind of a discussion here between the concrete, which is the artifact, and the ephemeral, which is the activity or the inspiration. And this translates back into play, where we have sort of the act of playing the game versus the artifact or the apparatus which enables it.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you might talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I mean, there are also artifacts in Lepidoptery. I mean, the butterflies themselves were really important to Nabokov. It wasn't like there were no objects there. That butterfly he caught, and if it was an important one, it was like a super precious object to him. And his collections are scattered all over the place because he had to move a lot. So, you know, for me, it's not as much about the difference between, you know, objects and activities as it is the quality, these different qualities of experience. Like, I just think a lot about how much pleasure and comfort and joy and intellectual stimulation that Nabokov got from that activity. And it's such a different and particular quality, and it's one that I really recognize, that's very similar to the kinds of things that I get out of games. And I sometimes wonder, in conversations about games and their potential, that it's not, those qualities just aren't that interesting to people. When they talk about let's elevate games and I want to be a progressive and I want to contribute to that conversation, but if elevating games means making them more like Nabokov's novels, then I think we're missing out. You know what I mean? Really what we have when we make games is we have authored works that are like Lepidoptery, right? They're like, it's like you're like designing it's like you're designing a drug, you're designing a nation with government, or you're designing a hobby, you're designing a field of science, or you're designing a language. And it provides a completely other value. So that was really, for me, the more important distinction.
Okay, so that's more like, say, the video game as apparatus that allows for that experience
that is capable of
capturing.
producing beauty as opposed to being beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
I feel like it was touched upon for at least one or two, but I didn't catch sort of the overall sense. Temporarily in these people's lives, were these activities that it sort of classify as avocational in tandem to their greatest works, precursors to them, or
good question.
After the fact?
Great question. So in the case of Vidkun Stein, it was, he wrote the Tractatus, which he thought had solved the problems of philosophy, and quieted the demonic voices in his head that would drove him to like write huge books. And then he went and like was a teacher for a while, and he's like, oh, I'm done with philosophy, you know. And he was a teacher, and then he stopped being a teacher because he couldn't stop beating the children. And then he was like a gardener for a couple of days at a monastery, and that really didn't work out. And then he went, and his sister needed this house, and so for 2 years he devoted himself to this. But then afterwards, he kind of drifted back into philosophy and teaching. And I think personally, his greatest work by far comes after the house, because they weren't really books, but in his thinking and his lectures and his writing that's been collected in his investigations, to me that's the Vidkun Stein that I love. In the case of Nabokov, his whole life was butterfly collecting and writing and literature. I think he knew early on that he was going to be a famous, successful writer. And so in some ways he was more passionate about butterfly collecting because that's what he felt he needed to prove something. But in that case, side by side, all of his great works, whatever you love, Lolita, Pale Fire, and Ben Sinister, or whatever, he was all the time, he was in shorts and a net running around. When he wasn't writing on little index cards, he was running around like an idiot. And Duchamp also, I think, played chess his whole life. Many of his great works are about chess. His important painting, that he has an important painting of his brothers playing chess. But they go hand in hand. He did both his whole life and traded off and on. And towards the end of his life, of course, there was all this talk about, oh, he's given up art for chess, which he would always disagree with. Like, I'm kind of doing them both simultaneously.
It's an important distinction that it's sort of a tandem symptom of the hyperactive brain as opposed to a winding down of it. It's not like they were finding their way out of those fields. It was while they're still doing the work, right? And
yeah. And it's very different. I mean, in the case of Vidkun Stein, architecture was very compressed into this period of his life, whereas these other guys, it was lifelong hobbies. So,
thank you.
Yeah. One more question.
Hi. Thank you so much. So there's somebody I want to add to your list.
Sure.
Okay, and it's C.L.R. James.
Okay.
He's a Caribbean scholar who worked on philosophy and social and political issues. And he wrote a book about cricket called Beyond the Boundary.
Ah, nice.
And he says in there, let me see, I'll look it up exactly. What do they know of cricket who only cricket know? And I think that's such a powerful and beautiful statement. And I wanted to bring that up for one reason in particular. There was a couple comments in the last two talks about introducing and including sort of non-Western models. And I think it's a perfect example of that, this exploration of the game of cricket and its dynamics and addresses some of the dynamics that you're talking about. And that brings up a second issue, which I really liked how you answered the question of why the interest and why the dual interest by these scholars. There's this cognitive, aspect of how we manage conceptual spaces. And I don't think it's just something that people with these hyperactive brains do. It's something that we all do, and I think that you're hitting on, that we have these tools, and games sort of get excluded from that conversation.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to
that's
congratulate
a good point.
you
I mean, obviously, the relationship of cricket to imperialism and colonialism is really
exactly.
complicated. I don't know if I would say that cricket is a non-Western game. It's a really that history is bloody and complicated and bloody awesome. But your point is well taken. And I would say that speaking of cricket, I mean the elephant in the room is baseball and sports in general, which is something that video game fans and scholars, except for the ones who love sports, but even the ones who love sports, they don't see that, they don't see the connection there,
right,
and they kind of hate sports, and they got picked on by jocks, but it's really, what I want to say is the jocks and the nerds together against everyone else. Or maybe just that what I think is so exciting to me is something that is as big as baseball, something that you teach your children and play with them their whole lives, and they teach their children, something that a nation can be built around, that we can make things like that. Right? That's pretty cool, right?
Or a world, like soccer.
Like soccer, that we're making things that are like that. So that's exciting.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.